Dr. Lara Sullivan is no stranger to the family here at Life Science Connect. Just this past January, in fact, she graced the cover of our Life Science Leader magazine for a story about her journey from Pfizer to biopharma entrepreneurship. That's just one of a handful of articles she's played a starring role in over the years. I'm Matt Pillar, and on today's episode of the Business of Biotech, Dr. Sullivan and I are going to dig into that story and how the asset strategy and portfolio development experience she's gained along the way are helping to shape her leadership at Pyxis Oncology, the clinical stage antibody drug conjugate and immunotherapy company she joined as CEO shortly after its founding in 2018. Pixis is working on 6 preclinical programs with Pyxis 106, its immuno-oncology candidate for thyroid, head and neck, and non-small cell lung cancer, and Pyxis 201, its ADC for breast and NSCLC, expected to lead the charge into phase 1. Dr. Sullivan brings a Cornell undergrad, a University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine MD, a Wharton MBA, and 6 years of VP level experience in asset management and development at Pfizer to the effort. Prior to Pixis, she led the launch of Pfizer-backed spin-out SpringWorks Therapeutics. Dr. Sullivan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. I always appreciate the chance to talk to the life science leader colleagues.
Cool. Well, we appreciate it. I'm thankful to have you. And obviously, I read that story that Rob, my former colleague and friend to this day, Rob Wright, wrote about you not too long ago. It was one of his swan songs, in fact, as he left Life Science Leader magazine. But one of the things that story didn't mention that I want to get into, I got to ask you about before we even get into the medicine and the work you're doing at Pixis is, so I'm looking at your undergrad in comparative literature from Cornell, right? So that you get your BA in comparative literature from Cornell. And then, I always like reading CVs or work and education experience on LinkedIn because you never get the full story. So all you can do is make assumptions, So I'm like, I want to fill in the gap between comparative literature and then, you know what, I'm going to go to med school, not just any med school. I think I'll shoot for Penn, right? We're going to do Penn, earn an MD, and then what? So from comparative literature to go into med school, what was the decision-making process there?
Yeah, no, I appreciate your asking that. And was talking with our communications colleagues earlier. Maybe I am the only CEO with a comparative literature degree in biotech right now. Who knows? Maybe. I've always been a big fan of the liberal arts. And actually, when I went to college, my intention was to dual major in English and chemistry because I had that sort of balanced mind of analytics, math, and science, but a love of literature and words. And when I got to Cornell, I went through all the kind of building blocks of a chemistry major, which happened to also be the pre-med coursework. But I found as it approached physical chemistry and the more advanced chemistry types of courses that I really wasn't that kind of researcher-oriented type of scientific thinker. At the same time, when I was taking my English classes, I had taken a few Spanish literature courses, and I found that very intriguing to kind of step outside the canon of American and British literature. And so I said, well, instead of English, I'm going to major in comparative literature. And I did half that major's coursework was in Spanish. So my Spanish is super rusty now, 30 plus years later, but back then, to be able to read and write, term papers in it and converse in it was just a lot of fun. So that was kind of the story. It was really the classic going to college and letting your interests drive you, as opposed to I must have X major because I want to do Y job in the future. Right. And I think that's actually never been my mindset, either in college or in any part of my career. Hence why some of these building blocks sort of require some kind of explanation because there's not a natural sort of straight line for them. Sure. But yeah, and I came from a medical family. Both my parents were physicians. And so I also had a little bit of I'm not going to do what mom and dad did when I was in college. So I wasn't really declaring pre-med as a focus. It was really more science.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Did mom and dad impose any sort of pressure on you to do what they did?
So actually, no, they were both career switchers later in life. Dad was a lawyer first before he went to med school, and mom was a teacher.
Mhm.
So I think our family has always been sort of a believer in find your own path. But I will say, uh, I had that kind of oppositional, you're both doctors, I like science, but I'm not going to be like you kind of thing for a few years when I was in college and even shortly thereafter. But then as I started making my way in the world and got a bit of a taste of the business world after college, I remember thinking, there's something to this medicine thing. Like I just sort of dismissed it in reaction to them as opposed to giving it a chance on its own merits. And so I found my way into it kind of on my own through volunteer work at Bellevue Hospital down in New York City, through really just wanting to think about having a career that had more direct impact on people than what I had experienced in my first job out of college, which was a, classic 2-year Wall Street analyst job, which taught me a lot, but wasn't really aligned with ultimately where I wanted to have impact. And so that kind of led me back to medicine as I was doing an internship at Bellevue Hospital while I was working in the Wall Street job. And that's when I said, huh, all right, maybe I shouldn't have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And I think I'm going to go to med school. And I remember telling my parents, and my dad like jumped out of his chair in excitement, and my mom was sort of like, are you sure? You've never
Mhm.
really talked about this before. Is this really what you want?
Yeah.
So that was sort of the genesis really of all of it.
Yeah. So the decision to go to med school. So I get sort of where that where it's rooted, but how refined was it at that time in terms of like what you wanted to do on the other side of med school? Were you thinking
Yeah.
like, yeah, I do want to go apply, my abilities to help people just generally? Were you thinking of practicing medicine? Were you thinking from day one, like, especially having a little bit of that flavor of Wall Street pre med school? Were you thinking from the outset of going into the business side? What was the intention?
Yeah. So it was really dual. There were sort of dual intentions there. One was to essentially, I went to med school with the intent to practice. So that was really my decision making calculus was around that. And that was really driven by the model I'd seen with mom and dad as physicians in rural upstate New York, where everyone knew the family. We touched everyone in the community in some shape or form because either mom or dad cared for them directly or cared for a relative. And it was a very sort of gratifying way to live. Um, what I had found in my Wall Street experience was it was a time probably not unlike today, where it was very turbulent back then in the early 90s in terms of the interest rate environment and so on. And so, anyway, there was a lot of upheaval at the bank. So the analysts ended up getting laid off and rehired sort of 3 times in the space of a year. And as a young, early 20 something, I said, well, business equals unstable, medicine equals stable and gratifying. And so I linked those two together and said, I'm going to go to med school, I'm going to practice, but I had enough business exposure at that time that I thought, let me get an MBA too, because maybe I can be one of those community physicians that's active in the local health system. So that
Mhm.
was really what I had intended to do when I got there. And I think those intentions were informed by, being pretty young at the, early 20s. I hadn't seen a lot. I didn't know that you could be an MD and operate in the health system in a way other than as a clinician or an administrator. I just hadn't seen that model. Um, and so when I went to Penn and I got exposed to what MDs and PhDs can do on the business side of healthcare, it was like a whole new world opened up. I think today, kids or younger people have much more exposure to all those different types of careers, but for me back then it was, doctor equals practice, chemistry
Yeah.
equals scientist equals researcher, Wall Street equals business equals unstable, and all that. None of those things are actually true, but that was what informed a lot of my impulses back then.
I think it's, yeah, may be more exposure, but I still don't think there's anywhere near enough, especially like at that. My perspective is that of the father of a 17-year-old boy who
Mhm.
is gifted academically. He's a very intelligent kid, super smart, does really well in science and technology and math. But he's also a very good communicator, very, very good writer. And he's at that point at 17 where he's like being pressured by guidance counselors and teachers to make big decisions about what he's going to do with the rest of his life. And I'm balancing the whole, like, you don't need to make giant decisions about what you're going to do with the rest of your life. One, because you're 17 years old. And to your point, about you kind of letting your career play out, let it play out. But two, I don't think that that kids do have necessarily the exposure to, I guess, the nuance, the interdisciplinary nuance of different fields of study, right? Like he looks at engineering as, engineering. He looks at chemistry as chemistry, biology as biology. I'm like, no, these things, if you play all three of those, intertwine them, twist them up like a pretzel, you are marketable for life, right? Like,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's pretty
Absolutely. I really do feel strongly when younger people come to me for career advice. I really do feel strongly about following a bit your interests. I'm not saying following your heart per se, because, sometimes that might lead you to a passion career that doesn't put food on the table. But I think it really, I think if you're doing something for the sake of society or because somebody thinks X or this is the path, I saw so many unhappy kids in med school who were there because of those reasons. And a lot of times those kids ended up, leaving after their residency. They, maybe became equity research analysts, or they did other things in the healthcare business world besides practicing medicine. And, some of them said, I would have just rather gone straight MBA, but the family pressure or the societal pressure, or I just have to know at X age, caught up with them. And so I've just tried, I don't know if it's been conscious or more, it started with that little rebellion against mom and dad, but I've just sort of let the interests lead me and figured things will end up working out. And they sort of work out in a way that I never would have projected going forward. But now sitting here, as the CEO of a biotech, I look back at every one of those experiences and I think about how much they contributed to what I'm doing today. I mean, even the communication part, I think I'm probably way more attuned to the importance of that in the organization and externally than, say, a PhD scientist CEO, who maybe never even just had many literature courses or just didn't value that discipline as much. It colors the way I think about everything, every single one of those experiences.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's the other thing I impress upon him is, so you've got the luxury of optionality because you leveraged your intellect to create that optionality. You're in a pretty comfortable position. You're even if Pixis weren't a thing, you're highly employable. And I'm telling my son this, carry it through, squeeze every drop of value you can out of your education, and then create that optionality for yourself. That way you have different paths you can choose. But I didn't invite you on the show to have a philosophical conversation about my son's life choices. What did you
we can do that over lunch one day.
Yeah, we'll do that. Yeah, next time we get together. When you got out of med school, earned your MD, did you go straight to Pfizer, or did you practice for a while?
Yeah, so that was the big choice. In the last year of the dual MD MBA program, when I was at Penn, there were half a dozen every year, and we literally split 3 and 3. 3 would go on to residency, 3 typically didn't. And I wrestled with that, and I ultimately decided not to go on to residency because I realized on the other end of the residency, I belonged in business. What the dual program taught me was it opened my eyes to all those different business careers with MD and PhD backgrounds, and that I was more of a sort of affiliated more naturally in the business world with the MD as a training, a credential, a way of thinking and understanding and seeing the world and the system that helped me be better in my business role. Yeah. And so if I were to have done residency, it would have felt like not a waste of time, but maybe a waste of systemic resources, because residencies are subsidized by, hospitals and the government. And why should the system pay to license me up if I wasn't going to be contributing in patient care directly? So that was part of it. And it was also just recognizing that, once you sort of figure out, when you've been wrestling with these things for a while and you sort of say, okay, I get what lane I want to operate in now. I was ready to go. So I did. So after I completed the program, I did about 9 or 10 years in consulting, management consulting. So I worked with big pharma primarily as my clients, dabbled a bit in biotech, dabbled a bit with some VC investor type of clients as well.
Were you an independent, Lara?
I was at McKinsey, actually.
Okay.
So, yep. So I served a lot of the big pharma, names that we all know and love. And what was terrific about that experience was it was almost like the postdoc, a business postdoc to your MBA, meaning you got to see all the business problems that you studied in your business school, but you saw them play out in different environments and different cultures. And so, there was you might have the same project around R&D efficiency in 3 different clients, and you'd come up with 3 different solutions because there were 3 different cultures, 3 different people dynamics, 3 different skill sets. And so it was a tremendous education on the business side of things that I draw upon today. It also gave me a lot of exposure to those different parts of the system. So, working with a few investors to understand how they did diligence and how they saw the world. I did a few projects with nonprofits and one for a distribution company that was, transferring clinical samples and those kinds of things. So it really gave me that holistic view. And the way I ended up at Pfizer was Pfizer had acquired Wyeth, and Wyeth had been one of my big clients. And so after the integration, many of my clients were over there and they said, we created this new role leading strategy and portfolio in the global R&D organization. Are you ready? Are you ready to come over and do some real work? They said. I said, absolutely. And
it's so easy to pick on consultants.
It really is. It really is. It really is. And so it was great because I was working with people I knew and trusted already. It was a highly impactful role right in the middle in Pfizer of what everybody wanted to talk about, which was the pipeline. I knew discovery through phase 2, all the therapeutic areas. I could get a meeting with anybody in Pfizer because everyone always wanted to know what was going on in R&D. So I felt like I was at the center of the action of the company. Right in the middle of it. And I used to go to work thinking this is the best job ever because it truly drew on my MD with the scientific elements of it. And it completely drew on my MBA and my analytical skills of, how do you strategically advance a portfolio, even with at the time, I don't know, the budget, we had a $2.7 billion budget, I think in research. I think the overall was like 7. Even with those numbers, there's still more that people want to do than what you can afford to do. And so that job really taught me the basics and the importance of the discipline of portfolio management.
That's ironic. And I'm going to hit fast forward here because I don't want to skip too far ahead, but we're going to talk about, obviously portfolio development at Pixis. But it's ironic that you should say, working at Pfizer with 2.7 to, $7 billion in resources, you learned discipline around, picking potential winners.
Absolutely. I mean, when and the genesis for my role, which had been newly created, and I remember my first day it was like 2 weeks after the Wall Street Journal had a big headline about Pfizer cutting its R&D budget. But the genesis had been after 10 years of serial acquisitions that, Pfizer had gone through, Warner Lambert and all that kind of stuff, they had lost that discipline. And so there was a recognition that, okay, we've done all these bolt-on acquisitions. This was 2011. So this is, over a decade ago. We've got all these great programs. We need to create an ongoing cadence of discipline in how we're funding our early research and our early clinical programs. So discovery through phase 2. And I'd say it took us collectively probably about 2 years to really embed that mindset and execution in the organization because it was a big change management approach to what had been before CSOs or therapeutic areas sort of having a bit of a, here's what I need. And it was sort of dispensed in the context of all these serial acquisitions. So it takes a while to settle organizations after big acquisitions like that.
Right.
And so my role and that work came on the heels of that. And it wasn't easy at the beginning. It wasn't easy. I remember my very first meeting there, a lot of the chief scientific officers were kind of like, well, who are you? Why are you here? And what are you going to do to my portfolio?
Sure. Like, who are you? Why are you here? And who gave you authority to do such high stakes work? Because we're talking about high stakes work, right? Like you're weighing in, if not pulling the strings on decision making around what's going to become, significant portfolios and candidates for a multi-billion.
Oh yeah. I'll tell you I tell this story a lot to anyone who'll listen, because it was such a catalytic learning moment for me in this role. When I came in, to your point, Wall Street Journal had an article cutting the research budget. It was, high stakes of how we were going to do this. And I remember thinking, okay, everybody understands we're doing this. There's a Wall Street Journal article about it. And okay, I'm coming into this new role. I've got my analytics freshly from McKinsey and from my Wharton degree. And all right, guys, here's how you slice and dice it. And that very first meeting, when we started talking about it, they all threw tomatoes at me. Who are you? What do you mean? We're not doing this. And it was 1 month into the job. And I remember walking home thinking like, oh, I was so discouraged. It's going to take a year and a half to get these people, these colleagues to understand why we have to do this. And so I kind of stepped back and thought about it for a few weeks. And I had another meeting with all these chief scientific officers a month after that first meeting. And I walked into that next meeting with a completely different approach. And I had no analytics, I had no tools. I had one PowerPoint slide with 3 giant bullet points on it. And it said, Ian Reed is going to ask you these 3 questions at the end of the year. And they were portfolio questions. It was like the return on investment. It was the cash position, whatever. It was business related questions on the pipeline that Ian Reed, CEO of Pfizer at the time, was going to ask them December 31st. Mm-hmm. So I just went into the meeting. I said, guys, you're all going to be asked these questions, not me. You are. And then they all said, well, wait, those tools that you talked about last time, will those help us answer the question? And I said, yes, those will help us answer the questions. And from that point, we were together, like we were on the same team. That's when I think they recognized that I was there to help them. And what I used to say was, my job was to be the ambassador of the science to the rest of the organization, that I represented the science. It didn't mean that I could promise every single piece of science would get funded, but that if we work together to look at the science through a commercial lens and an execution lens and a scientific one, and it came out that that was the best science to go forward, that I would absolutely be their ambassador. I would go to the commercial organization. I would go to the corporate, portfolio committee and represent it. And so that I was so grateful for that experience so early in that role, because it created that alliance between me and the scientists that allowed us collectively to really do that tough work of rationalizing a large portfolio back then.
Yeah. Yeah. You come into a role like that. I think regardless where you come from, moving into that role, you've got some bias that you bring along with you kind of inherently, right? Like in your case, you had an MD, you had some science background. Your bias is probably a little bit maybe less skewed because you had plenty of business background as well. But where do you lean? Like when I guess give us some foundational advice or some fundamentals around where to objectively where to lean when working on portfolio strategy or candidate analysis. And I ask you that question because I think it's highly relevant to a fair percentage of the folks who listen to this podcast. We have a lot of founders who are perhaps building companies on maybe more so, 12 months ago than at this specific point in time, but who are perhaps building companies on single assets or considering building a company on a single asset, much less, having multiple shots on goal, as they like to say. So just give us some of your, you've been there, you built a career on it, right? So just give us some foundational kind of fundamental for first timers advice on where to really lean heavily in terms of objectively analyzing potentials.
Yes, no, I'm happy to. And I could literally talk for hours on this, so I'm going to try to keep it to a few bullet points.
I know that was a very unfair question I asked.
No, it's one of my favorite topics. That's why I could talk for hours on it. So I think for me, I am a fundamental believer. It's a core belief in portfolio management, meaning diversification of risk. And I think about risk the way I think we've been taught about energy. Energy takes different forms, risk takes different forms. So certain programs might be higher risk commercially and lower risk technically. Another program might be higher risk technically and lower risk commercially. Mm-hmm. You might have another program yet that's completely, de-risked technically, which is a term we like to use, which is actually a misnomer. Nothing's really de-risked until it's approved, but we use that. You might have a technical de-risked program, but it's got high operational execution risk. And I think that to run a company effectively, whether it's a small biotech where you even have one or two assets, to Pfizer or, Novartis that have huge portfolios, you have to have a much more nuanced understanding of the types of risk. You never really de-risk, it just changes form and how you choose to handle that form of risk. So in the case of Pixis, we have constructed a very sort of deliberately balanced portfolio across modalities and across kind of first in class and best in class. And even if you look in a more nuanced way at the assets, some of our programs are, because they're more novel, have more technical risk, and others, because they're precedented, are more commercial risk. Will they truly, make a difference in the marketplace? Mm-hmm. So I hold that as an empirical belief. Now, does that mean my belief is right? No. What I've also seen is that, and this goes back to my consulting days, the best strategy for the company is the strategy that fits for the people and the type of decision makers in that company. So in other words, if I have a belief around portfolio management and I see a diversified big portfolio, but I'm working with investors or colleagues who are hell-bent on the binary risk, let's take a single asset or a double asset approach, we're going to have conflict. And it doesn't mean their approach is right or my approach is right. It just means we're not in sync, and that makes it hard for the decision-making of the portfolio, period. So, I, my core belief around this has driven how I've assembled and continued to advance Pixis and the people that we've attracted to it. Mm-hmm. It certainly doesn't mean it's the only route to success, but I do think when you have a mismatch amongst all the stakeholders around, diversifying versus focus, you're going to set the organization up for failure if you're not on the same page philosophically around that. Yeah. And that was actually something I really vetted hard when I took the Pyxis job with the Pyxis Series A investors. And one of the reasons I was attracted to Pyxis was it had a huge amount of IP out of Tom Gajewski's lab at the University of Chicago, who had done a lot of work in hot tumor and cold tumor IO models. And so we had, literally hundreds of targets and genes to build a company off of. And that appealed to me versus some of the other opportunities I was looking at that said, here's the single asset or the single mechanism, and we're going to have, a platform off of this single mechanism. That felt like a very concentrated risk profile to me. Again, it's not bad. It just didn't fit my worldview of how I wanted to build the company. And so I gravitated towards Pixis. So that's one piece of it. I think the other piece of it, maybe it's not portfolio management per se, but I think that is super, super important, particularly in today's landscape, is amazing teams can do great things with mediocre science, and mediocre teams can kill spectacular science. And so there's a piece around the analytics, the portfolio management of all of that. But what I saw time and time again, sitting in the development committee meetings at Pfizer and getting to know the development teams, is how much the human element played into the ultimate outcome of the programs. Yeah. And, we would have these decision-making meetings around budget approvals for certain programs. And my team would do all the analytics, and we did a lot. And we would look at it collectively. The leadership team, Dolston and his leadership team would look at it collectively. But then we would also have a closed door around the horn session based on experience and pattern recognition. And sometimes that trumped the analytics. And so I think for new entrepreneurs or new executives, relying on seasoned people in your team is one of the ways you can help cover your risk of execution and even strategic decision making, because the pattern recognition, the value of that in this industry is so high.
Yeah.
And I don't know that there's a shortcut to that. And I think one of the things that we lack in the industry, that I would borrow a page from medicine on this. Medicine, a medical residency is an apprenticeship, right? It's teaching doctors how to be doctors before they unleash them into the hospitals on their own. I think we need that in biotech executive training across all disciplines, because those seasoned people, whether they've been, trained by a Pfizer or Novartis, or they've been in biotech for 30 years, can help teach those patterns to the up and comers and the younger folks. And I think having a mix of that in a company is also a great way to help support the portfolio. So it's almost like a portfolio of assets and a portfolio of people's experiences.
When you're striving to excel in a new arena, the best guides are the ones already doing it well. The Business of Biotech brings those voices forward to help new and emerging biopharmas turn their innovations, like mRNA and cell and gene therapies, into clinical realities. Tune in and subscribe for insights on hiring, regulatory, and other need-to-know topics for biopharma leaders. The podcast is brought to you in collaboration with Cytiva. Check out their resources at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA.com/emerging biotech. Wow, you're an easy interview. I asked you a great big giant question, and it wound you up and let you go.
I know.
But I've got questions, follow-up questions on that,
Sure.
right? So the pattern recognition and the people. So this marriage, obviously, of the assets and the people, I understand that completely. But I'm curious about what you found. Like, were the people in place at Pixis when you joined? I mean, it was founded in 2018. You joined in 2019, and maybe. So maybe a two-part question. Give us a little bit of the backstory as to how you became plugged in, like your level of involvement in that kind of formative part of the company's inception, and then take us through maybe some of the early steps around your role in ensuring that the talent that was capable of that pattern recognition and to confidently have those around the horn sessions early on. Your role in ensuring that was there, that team was there.
Absolutely. So I was very fortunate because the founders of Pixis, David Steinberg from Longwood Fund, Tom Gajewski from University of Chicago, and John Flavin from Portal Innovations out in Chicago, who's our board chair now, really did all the tough legwork of putting the company together in 2018, negotiating with the University of Chicago, getting, working with Tom to define what work out of his lab was going to form the core of Pyxis. And so when the company was born in 2018, it really was born around IO. That was the focus, that was the remit. And even if we rewind back a few years, I think that was sort of a time when IO was a really, hot modality as well. So there was financing around for it. It took them probably, I don't know, anywhere from 6 to 12 months from 18 into 19 to kind of get the company up and running off the ground. The very first employee was a University of Chicago post business school student, or science student, who helped get the company off the ground. And then the founders, David Steinberg, the Longwood model is that they sit as the acting CEO for the first few months of the company to get the initial components of the team built. So David did that as the founding CEO. And he started to put together the scientific team. So there were a few scientists, biologists that were hired in. They brought on Ronald Herbst, who had been VP of Discovery Oncology at MedImmune as the Chief Scientific Officer. And then they started looking for the permanent CEO, and that's where I came into the mix. And I had known Christoph Westphal over at Longwood and had known Longwood Fund for years. Christoph and I had connected in the context of Pfizer and SpringWorks and previous work together. And And when I saw the proposal around Pixis with that diversity of IO IP, that really dinged the bell for me of, oh, this fits my worldview on diversification. But the second big criteria that I had was a board and a set of investors that really empowered management to build the business. So that's the Longwood model. The Longwood model is very entrepreneurial CEOs. You know, they get the company put together, they spend those few months there getting it off the ground, and then they basically say, they hand it to you. See, it's yours. Now you live and die by it. You know, call us if you need any help, but you know, it's really up to you.
Right.
And that was super appealing to me. And I think the third criteria was then just that we had some of the team in place with the expertise, and and David had already done that. So sort of the diversity of IP, the entrepreneurial executive model, and then the scientific team in place. Those were the three criteria I needed, and they were there.
Mm-hmm.
So I joined December of 2019. I think I was employee number 7, and so we had a couple weeks together before, you know, holiday break, and then going over to JP Morgan. And at JP Morgan, you know, my objective there, JP Morgan 2020, I guess the last in-person one that we had, was really to get Pixis sort of on the radar screen of various investors, because the Series A was 22 million. That was not a very big Series A. And I knew we were going to have to get a Series A extension or a Series B rather quickly. So I began with Ronald to socialize the company and socialize the IP. Now, remember, we were extremely early stage. At that point, we had maybe 1 or 2 programs that we had just started working on that David and the team had gotten underway, but we were target level early stage discovery. So that's a really early stage company. And what we found at JP Morgan was people were saying, come back to us, your IO, come back to us when you're ready to go into the clinic. Then we'll be interested in talking more about funding. And I remember thinking, 22 million is not going to last us to the clinic. So, you know, how are we going to navigate this? And I recognized with Ronald and the team that we already had in place that we had a diversity of modality expertise beyond just IO. And so if we were going to have an IO portfolio, why not have a multimodality portfolio and continue to build out a diversified oncology company, and sort of chart our course that way. We're here to help patients. We're kind of agnostic at the end of the day to what modality will do that. And we have the skills and experiences as a team to expand beyond our founding IO area of expertise. And so we started to think about what those adjacent modalities would be. And the ADC came up as a key modality because they sit in a nice adjacency to IO, where, you know, ADCs are tumor killing machines. They target the tumor very directly, but at the same time, they recruit locally the immune system and create a local immune response to help in the tumor cell killing. So it was a nice complement to the IO that we had. And so we started thinking about that. And on March 12th, 2020, and I always think of March 13th as the day the pandemic really began, because it seemed like that Friday the 13th was when everyone started shutting down in mass, even though some had done it a little earlier, some did it a little later. But Friday, March 12th, we were supposed to be down at Pfizer to meet with the oncology colleagues down there who I wanted to introduce Pixis to them. And they had some things they were working on to talk to us about. And that's when they basically said they were planning to spin out their ADC preclinical work, and they wanted to talk about how I did that at SpringWorks, where I spun the assets out of Pfizer. So we couldn't do that.
Which, by the way, that's a point in your career trajectory that we completely skipped over.
Oh, yeah.
But we don't need to go there. We're gonna run out of time. But if anyone's interested in that phase, I think that's well covered in that Life Science Leader article.
In Rob's, yes.
So yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just
no, that's okay.
That reference in there. SpringWorks was a new one to this
audience. Yes, no, that was really I almost think of it like a slide out of pharma. Like I jumped on a slide out of pharma into biotech, and the gamma secretase inhibitor and the SpringWorks assets were that slide. And it was a tremendously exciting experience. And yes, it's covered well in Rob's podcast. So Pfizer had called up saying, we want to do this again and walk us through how you did this with SpringWorks, because it was a different part of Pfizer. And again, this was March 12th, 2020. So we did this by phone. And I shared a few observations with them. And a week later, when we got back on the phone, the world had dramatically changed.
Mhm.
And they said, we had been planning to spin this out and get a Series A around it and wanted your advice on it. And I said, well, yeah, why don't you think about spinning it into an existing management team? Because I'm not sure there's a lot of VCs doing Series A's right now, March, April, May of 2020.
Right.
And they agreed. And so they pivoted to thinking of it as a spin in to Pixis. And for us, it worked really well because we already had that desire to go into adjacent modalities. And from Pfizer's perspective, as we all know now, we didn't know then, they had a lot going on with vaccines. And so for them to mess around with, trying to get VCs, wait for them to come back, all that kind of stuff, there was just a sense of urgency. And so it was a real symbiotic meeting of the minds. And to me, it just goes to a lot of the timing is everything. But when you look over your career, the relationships that you've built and the work that you've done leads to some of that timing is everything.
Mhm.
So it was really fortuitous, and we enjoyed a really tight working relationship with Pfizer over the course of 20 into 21 as we worked to license in those ADC programs and their preclinical engine. So in addition to the IO engine that we have from Tom, we now have the 10-year Pfizer ADC discovery engine that had been optimized for linker conjugation chemistry and payload technology. And I knew it personally because I knew a lot of the scientists who worked on it. And so from that perspective, it felt like a very natural fit to come into Pixis.
Mhm.
And so while I was not the founder of Pixis in the very early days, I think collectively the way the Series A board, the Series B board, and our management team looks at it is we sort of rebirthed Pyxis 2.0 with this more multimodality expansion now.
Yeah.
And we are really squarely in the camp of building a truly diversified oncology company, multimodality, multi-assets. We're continuing to look at other modalities as we speak, because it ultimately goes back to the patient. And when you build a team that has enough breadth of expertise, you can do that. And again, it goes to my philosophy and the people who work at Pyxis's philosophy around breadth. And it's not right or wrong. It's just the path we've chosen. And the reason I think it's working is because we're all aligned around it. The board is aligned around it. The management team is aligned around it. And the talent that we attract is aligned around it.
Yeah. Yeah. You took the liberties that Longwood model wanted to give you as an entrepreneur, and you made the most of them, right? I mean, the 2.0 reference is not lost. I mean, it's a very quick 2.0, right? Hey, here's a newborn company, and a couple months later, you got version 2.0. And I want to give you, like I said, we are running a bit short on time here, but I want to give you a little bit of time to talk about what the manufacturing approach will look like, or what your plans are there. I know you're obviously early stage. So multimodality, and this is where I guess I'll start with this. You bring on the IP, the technology, the engine to get into the world of ADCs from Pfizer. You mentioned that you knew it because you knew the scientists at the time when you were working there who were working on development. What else did you, before we get into what your manufacturing and clinical paradigm might look like, what else did it take for you as the leader of the company, and for Pixis as a company, to confidently move forward with the execution of a multimodality approach? Did you have to bring any of those scientists on board? Did you bring any talent on board that was had very ADC specific intelligence, or is it more of a situation where you're like, hey, we have the technology and we can pretty much outsource everything else? What's that look like?
So we actually, it's a great question. I think one of the critical success factors, and I observed this through both SpringWorks and Pixis now in the relationships with Pfizer, is having that connection with the innovator that you're getting the IP from, because that institutional knowledge around those assets is so precious, and you can't document it fully in these transfer documents. So we actually were fortunate. We were able to engage about a dozen ex-Pfizer colleagues in manufacturing, in commercial, in chemistry, to give us advice and guidance and work for us as consultants while we were going through the licensing. And many of the, so when Pfizer spun those ADCs out, they had also shut down the site where many of the people were employed. So a lot of those employees ended up getting a new job, into new roles in new companies before Pfizer spun the assets out. And so we missed the ability to hire a bunch of them because they already landed, but we did have the ability to work with the ones who decided to set up their own consulting shops. And they were tremendously valuable. And we enjoy a really warm working relationship with Pfizer to this day, because some of those colleagues are also still within Pfizer, and it's a warm relationship also with the BD, with legal, with everybody that's involved in this. And I think it's better for us and it's better for them when you have that warmth of relationship, because it's just there's stuff that you need to make sure these assets go forward smoothly that just you can never think about in a contract at the moment. So we hired in some of the blanks, both on a consulting basis and now on a full-time basis, to fill in the blanks where we needed it technically across the organization. So now we have a CMC group, for example. We have an interim CTO. He was the former CTO at Velos Bio in ADCs, Mike's son. So he's been under, it's a 2-year interim CTO role. So he's, midway through that contract with us. So we're going to figure out, what our permanent role will be from there. But you sort of have in these building of the biotechs, and I'm sure you've seen this and talked about it with a lot of your interviewees. I think of it like a relay race where somebody's holding the baton for a certain leg, and then the next person picks it up for the next leg and the next one. And so having all those ex-Pfizer colleagues as advisors, having Mike come in, what he did last year to help us build the CMC function, has been tremendous. And then, eventually as you amass capital, as you amass more assets, you get to a more steady state, sort of more traditional company type of structure, which is where we're headed eventually.
Yeah, very good. How many, what's your, I guess, head count at this point? You said that you were number 7.
As number 7. Yes, we're up to around 60 now.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, and we had a holiday party in December, right when Omicron was coming through, which was regrettable, obviously, for the timing, but it was great to see everybody. And I realized at that holiday party, at the time we were around, I don't know, 50. 2/3 of the company had been hired since the pandemic, and only like a third had been before the pandemic. And it just was such a startling realization, because this history that I'm talking about, most of them hadn't experienced it. They had experienced Pyxis 2.0, and they'd also experienced Pixis in a virtual model. And one thing I'll say about that, because we started out with this diversity approach, it even extended to geography. So, the IP came from Chicago, the financing came from Boston, Ronald, the CSO, came from Maryland, I came from New York. We already had geographic diversity. And so as we've grown the company in the hybrid world, we've grown it without any fear of geographic diversity. In fact, we've embraced it. So we have people in 12 states, and I have folks that are going to be coming in every day, and I have folks that'll come in once a quarter. And, it's working really well for us because, again, it fits the culture of how we've operated from the beginning. And not a lot of companies, would necessarily do it that way, or do it to the extreme that we are, if their philosophy doesn't align with it. It has to be a fit. Yeah.
And a lot of that's adaptive too. I'm sure if you want to be fully transparent about it, you launch a company in 2018, 2019, in its formative years, suffer through the pandemic, right? You've got to be adaptive and figure out what works. And the pandemic influences that adaptability. And then, another thing I wanted to ask you about is so you guys IPO'd. You IPO'd in October 21?
Yes.
Let's say 6 months ago, maybe 6 or 7 months from when this podcast will drop. And the ensuing, 6 to 7 months are pretty pretty crappy on the biotech market. So
Totally.
there's another big milestone, but it's been an experience, I'm sure, for Pixis. So a couple more questions and I'll let you
Yeah.
off. That's one I wanted to get to. Like and I've had a few conversations with, early stage, newly public biotechs in the last few weeks about this. And, I'm just curious what your advice is for other companies that are kind of new like you, maybe even newer, and kind of suffering through this bearish market.
Yeah, I'll tell you, certainly none of us saw this coming. And I sort of think of it like we had a 2-year global pandemic, and now we have like a 2-year biotech pandemic.
Yeah.
Because everyone, bankers we've talked to have said they think it'll take 18 to 24 months to flush all this stuff out of the system. So yes, we were, I think, one of the last IPOs to really get out before people recognized things changed. That first week in the fourth quarter that we went, there were 3 or 4 other IPOs, and I think we and the bankers all started seeing just some, you started seeing soft signals that you didn't know were signals yet. Some just shifts in how different hedge funds or different long-term healthcare investors were thinking about IPOs. That was very different than it had been 6 months prior. So we had decided, after we raised our Series B in March of 21, we literally closed our Series B, and immediately, like in parallel with it, began preparing for the IPO, because the conditions were so good in the early part of 21 that we felt we needed to amass capital while we could.
Yeah.
So I think that principle applies regardless of market conditions, not necessarily racing to IPO, but amassing capital where you can, when you can. And what that may mean today for people that are pre-IPO is maybe there's an extra round, a Series C, or maybe it's a bigger B, or maybe it's a bigger A. But really shoring up the access to capital when you can get it is so important. And I'm really, really, really grateful we did that, even though we are one of the 90% of the IPOs in 21 that's underwater. We're in good company with the other 90% that are out there, but we have the capital, and we have the capital that'll get us through our next inflection point. And so we also know that, as painful as it is to watch the stock go up and down and be really low as it is like today, I also know it's not connected to the fundamentals of Pixis particularly.
Yeah.
It's a class effect. It doesn't excuse us as management from not paying attention to it. I'm not saying that at all. We do absolutely pay attention to it, but we also, how do I say it? We don't get distracted by the stock price at the expense of focusing on the fundamentals of the business.
Sure.
And so we're focused on execution. We've got these, 2 programs that we expect an IND the second half of this year, 2 programs with an IND the second half of next year. We've got our preclinical engine continuing to crank. We've got our business development asset acquisition engine continuing to crank. We still, as of the end of March, we have $253 million still on our balance sheet. So we're sort of battening down the hatches on execution, but we're also sort of buyers and acquirers of great science. I think depending on where you're at in your financing cycle right now, the companies that are seed or Series A are probably, in better shape because they can ride out this next 18 to 24 months than the companies right in the spot of they need money in less than 18 months and their Series B or their Series C. And I think in that case, really, shoring up your relationships with your investors who back you. I mean, that, our IPO book was very much a mirror of our Series B book. And so, those investors carried through. And I think those were investors that we had, great relationships with, and who, see this as ultimately a longer term investment, not just Pixis, but the whole, the whole thing,
Sure.
their philosophy, their investment philosophy. So, I mean, my advice to people sort of on the cusp of it now is, continue to monitor market conditions. If they change and there's a window, grab it. If there's not a window, don't be shy to get another round of private financing. Some bankers have started talking about, considering debt as an augment to equity, which, we hadn't seen for a while. I think non-dilutive funding with big pharma partnerships, or, if you're in the rare disease area, patient advocacy communities, I think all those things are really, really important. it is rough waters, but I actually, what I say to my team is that these are the conditions where good companies separate themselves from everybody else. You
Mhm.
know, if you've got great people, great science, and strong relationships, you'll make it through. It has been painful. I'm not going to lie. In the
Sure.
last
Yeah.
6 months, it's been, if I imagine somebody in the day of the IPO, if somebody told me that stock would be in the $3 range today, I would have been shocked. I just couldn't have even conceived of it.
Yeah.
And yet here we are, and we actually are at peace with it because we're focused on building the business. We have the capital. We have, great relationships with a lot of our investors. And so, we're
Well, and you,
focusing
as
on
you
what we can
said,
do. Yeah.
yeah, and as you said, I mean, the entire class is in the same. It's like when, speaking of my son, it's like when my son comes home and tells me he did poorly on a test, but everyone in the class did, right? Like there's
Yeah.
there's some sense of solace in the fact that everyone's in the same proverbial boat. So yeah, I'm gonna let you wrap things up on an entirely positive note,
Sure.
Dr. Sullivan. I want to know what you're most excited about. You gave me a bit of an update on the pipeline, right? So you told us you got a couple of INDs coming up this year, a couple more potentially next year. And while we can't get into the deep details on every single asset, I guess maybe give us a highlight or two what you're most excited about pipeline development wise.
Yeah, so I think the two most advanced programs with the INDs coming up this fall are both exciting for different reasons. So our Pix201 program is one of the ADCs we got from Pfizer, which is a non-internalizing ADC. And what that means is that the toxin, the payload, is released in the local tumor environment, not inside the tumor cell. And it has a very strong preclinical profile and data package from Pfizer. So we are hopeful and optimistic, as we always are, when you take things from mice to humans, and getting it into humans in the fall. My hope is that if that particular approach bears fruit, it's a very generalizable approach across a variety of tumor types, and it actually becomes a new way of thinking about ADCs, because most ADCs are internalizing, meaning the cell engulfs the toxin and the toxin's released in the tumor cell. So if our approach works, it's got a whole broad applicability to a bunch of tumor types, but it also opens up another area of scholarship and inquiry in the ADC field.
Hmm.
And we're bullish on it because the preclinical data is so strong.
Yeah.
So I'm super excited about that. And I think the Pix106 program, which is the novel, which is the new program that we brought in from Bioshin, which is in IO, is an anti-Siglec 15 program. And essentially that's a best in class opportunity. So we think it's going to really add a lot to the work in that particular target. So again, excited about both of them for different reasons,
Yeah.
another sort of mini portfolio diversification concept at play.
Sure.
So,
Yeah. Excellent. Well, good news. You guys, it's an exciting company with a great backstory and a great story unfolding. I mean, the backstory is not too deep. It's a relatively young company, but a lot happening since you took the reins there. A lot of great work. I appreciate you for coming on and sharing the story with us. I appreciate your transparency. By the way, I just want to make note of that. Like you're very, very honest and forthcoming and transparent. And I appreciate that.
thank you.
I spend a lot of time talking to biotechs who just want to stick to the talking points that their PR police allow them to talk about. And
I know.
You're willing to share.
Thank you.
I like that. So thank you.
Hopefully I won't get in trouble with my CFO after.
Oh yeah. Well, if
I don't,
the CFO requires a review, we may be able to do a little editing, but we'll try to
I
avoid
think
that.
she's trained me well, so hopefully I did all right. But no, it was really great to talk to you as well. I really enjoyed it, and these are topics near and dear to my heart, and I appreciate the chance of being able to share some thoughts with your readers, and definitely look forward to talking more over lunch or whenever on any of these topics. So
Yeah, for sure. We're definitely going to have a part 2, maybe a part 3, part 4, because there's a lot to talk about here. So
thank you. Great.
So that's
All
Pyxis
right.
Oncology CEO, Dr. Lara Sullivan. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online in partnership with our friends at Cytiva, who offer a comprehensive suite of resources to support early stage biotechs at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. Check that out. Go to bioprocessonline.com and subscribe to my newsletter. And if you're enjoying this podcast, subscribe, leave us a review, tell your colleagues about it. And as always, thank you for listening.